my screen to advance. There we go. So remember last week, or we talked about the layman's definition of a weed. A weed is basically a plant out of place. It's unwanted growth. It can be an invasive garden plant. It can be a garden thug. And so keep in mind that first one there, unwanted growth. One of the problems I see with a lot of gardeners is they divide their perennials and they keep thinking they have to plant that perennial. You know, it's very liberating when you get to the point where you realize you don't have to save every plant. It's okay to kill a plant. It's okay to pull those or throw those divisions away. So I'm going to add this time, even some of our desirable perennials, if you've got too many of them, you don't have to plant them everywhere. You don't have to feel obligated to give it away to every friend and neighbor. You know, there's only so much Monarda, or there's so many Stellidae auras people really want in the world. And so sometimes it's okay just to discard those plants. But we normally think about weeds as being more of those invasive plants, crabgrass, other type of things, or like I said here, the garden thug. You know, the difference between an invasive plant is a plant that, an exotic plant that we planted that has escaped and taken over our naturalized areas. So honeysuckle, Bradford pear, ornamental pear, those are invasive plants. Garden thugs are those that we cannot control easily. Like I got mint here in the picture, and there's a few others. And so why weeds? Well, we talked about last time that they thrive in many conditions. A lot of them reseed freely. You know, crabgrass has hundreds of thousands of seeds. A lot of them have really extensive underground root systems. So bindweed, for instance, has root system that goes 10, 15 feet deep. Good seed dispersal method. You know, white avens, the one that has little stick-like type seeds, they stick to the fur of animals. They get spread far and wide. And basically, they're opportunistic. You know, the old saying, you give a weed an inch, it'll take a yard. They're just very good at survival. You know, many weed seeds can lay dormant for 5, 10, 15 years, and then under the right conditions can germinate. So, you know, weeds are just a fact of life because they outcompete a lot of our desirable plants. And as I said earlier, you know, those garden thugs, those are plants that we plant sometimes, they get away from us. And here's a short list. I know last week there was a few more that people added in their own world because everyone kind of has their hot buttons for what they like, dislike. This past week, I got an email from a master gardener with the chameleon plant, moved into a house property and it's popping up everywhere. And if you ever try to move the Houtotonia, the chameleon plant, it also smells absolutely awful when you start cutting and digging it in. So just be careful when you plant plants. Be careful getting plants other friends because you don't know what tag along may be in there. And if someone's dividing a plant and has a lot of it to offer and give away, sometimes you want to question whether or not you really want that plant in your garden because it maybe spread a little bit more than you want it to spread. So let's kind of review with our little basic botany lesson again. So an annual plant completes its life cycle in one season. I mentioned there's actually kind of two ways we call annuals. One is this true definition. So it comes up, it flowers, it dies. No matter what you do, it's not going to live on. And then we call plants that die with a frost also an annual because they die at the end of one season. Biennials require 2 seasons. First year they're vegetative, second year they flower, and then they die. You know, a lot of the thistles, like musk thistle, we have in our wild, that's a biennial. And then we have a perennial that really lives for more than 3 season duration. That doesn't mean they live forever. That same definition applies to our garden plants. We think of perennial forever. And unfortunately, with many perennial weeds, unlike our garden plants that we desire, they don't last that long. They do last that long, and we really have a hard time getting rid of them. And probably in the big scheme of things, the hardest weeds to control are going to be the perennial weeds because of that extensive root system. The annuals, you know, they're going to die at the end of the season no matter what we do, but those perennials come back year after year. And we also talked about then there's different classifications of weeds. So there's the grassy weeds, those are the monocots with that grass-like structure. Broadleaf weeds are dicots, have their leaves in pairs. And then of course, sedges are not grasses. Sedges are not broadleaf weeds. They're their own classification and group. They've got triangular stems, identify them. And the reason this is important, if someone has their mic unmuted with a ticking clock, please mute it. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to control a grass out of a grass, a broadleaf out of a broadleaf. It's easier to take care of a grass and a broadleaf or a broadleaf and a grass because their structures are very similar. And so as chemicals have been developed, they're getting more and more, how do I want to say it? They're getting better at being able to selectively control a grass out of a grass or a broadleaf out of a broadleaf. But it is more difficult when they are more closely related, monocots or dicots. And then of course, those products that are targeting grassy broadleaf weeds really usually have a very poor job of controlling sedges. And we'll get into particular products here in just 1 second. So keep in mind with grassy annual weeds, they can germinate either the spring or the fall, like crabgrass, foxtail, they both germinate in the spring. Annual bluegrass germinates in the fall. And why this is important, because this is going to tell us about control times. When's the ideal time to control? So going back to last time's session about knowing your weeds, we really focused more on their habitat or how they germinate, when they germinate. It sets them up for ideal times of control. And then of course we have those perennial grassy weeds, which are much more difficult to control. As I just said, it's sometimes very hard to selectively control zoysia, Bermuda grass out of your bluegrass fescue lawn because they're so closely related. And so we have to have different arsenals or different methods of control. And same goes for broadleaf annual weeds. We have those that germinate the spring and the fall. So the henbit, the chickweed, those germinate in the cool of September, October. Spurge, the little doily plant that's out there now, it's a heat of the summer plant. So then here again, when we would put something down to potentially prevent them from germinating or controlling them is going to vary depending on when they germinate. And then of course, we have those perennial broadleaf weeds, which are probably some of the hardest actually to control. Especially like the bindweed, the poison ivy, those type of things, because like any perennial plant, they have the crown, they have a root system that they come back for. And one thing that perennial weeds are really good at doing is storing a lot of food and energy in their root system, in their storage parts, and just makes it more and more difficult because they already have this will to survive, and they just have a better defense mechanism against chemicals and able to regerminate or resprout after we have some sort of control. And of course, the most normal grass weed we talk about with sedge is the yellownet sedge, the watergrass, those type of things. We'll talk about chemicals here just a little bit. Keep in mind, all these are different classifications of weeds. So Karen, I don't think there's any questions that have popped up, but I'll just stop right there on our review session before we move into new content today.
We are good for now.
Okie doke. Perfect. Okay, so that was our quick review. So prevention obviously is the key to weed control. If we can ever stop them from germinating, taking a foothold, getting in our flower gardens or vegetable garden is going to be the best method. So the key is then, how do we prevent weeds, or what cultural practices can we do to reduce the germination and or growth of weeds? And let's face it, weeds are never going to go away. They're opportunistic. They're always going to be wanting to invade our garden. Keep in mind, a weed is more than just what we think it might be a weed. One of my biggest things I fight in my garden is redbud seedlings, hackberry seedlings that germinate from the falling trees around. That's not something you'd normally think about being a weed, but it's a plant out of place. It's a plant that I don't want. It's unwanted. If I let them grow, I'd have a forest. I would not have a vegetable or a flower garden. So here again, your definition of weed is whatever gives, is unwanted in your area. So how do we prevent weeds? Here's the strategies that work best. Reduce soil cultivation. As I said last time, most weeds require sunlight for germination. And so the more you disturb, turn that soil, even for a split second or less than a split second, let's say a nanosecond of light will cause many seeds to germinate. And so we normally think about soil cultivation as the way to control weeds. But think of it more about every time you cultivate that soil, you're exposing more seeds to sunlight and you're actually increasing the germination of weeds. So it's kind of a vicious circle. So our overall goal is to reduce soil cultivation. You know, we talked about mulch also is probably the best way to prevent weeds. You know, it'll prevent probably 80, 90% or more of all annual weeds. Unfortunately, mulches will not take care of perennial weeds because of that, here again, that aggressive root system and crowns and grow through it. But mulch works by reducing that sunlight and suffocating those weeds out before they have a chance to germinate and to establish. Another way to prevent weeds is plant canopies. So the more those plant canopies come together, the more they shade the soil and outcompete the weeds for sunlight. So a lot of times, you know, denser plantings in flower gardens is a great way to do that. In vegetable gardens, you know, we've got to have this kind of give and take. You know, we can't crowd the plants so much that they become competitive with each other to reduce photosynthesis and production, but we can put those plants closer together to shade out the soil. So that's one of the reasons people like raised bed gardens, is because that plant density is so tight, as opposed to the traditional garden where you have a row every, you know, 2-3 feet, and then you have all this space for sunlight to beat down, for weeds to germinate. And so even in a traditional garden, you can still use that wide row block method of planting instead of planting everything in rows to help reduce cultivation, more weeds, and then also decrease that plant canopy. And then the other way to help reduce weeds is to get rid of the weeds around the garden, around your property. You know, the biggest lament is, you know, I can't get rid of the dandelions in my yard because my neighbor does nothing to control their dandelions, and all that weed seed blows in. So remember, they're opportunistic. So, you know, if you've got a vegetable garden, flower garden, you know, you've got weeds growing all around it, you're going to have more pressure. And that's one of the reasons why, you know, there's a trend. I actually got this question yesterday that really brought this home. You know, a lot of people are planting more native gardens, or they want this little prairie in their backyard. And, you know, the reason the Flint Hills works is because there's thousands of acres of natural tall grass prairie. So there's very few weeds, vegetation surrounding that prairie as a whole, except on the edges. But when you've got a little 100, 200,000 square foot little native prairie garden in your backyard, there's a lot of edge. There's a lot of edge that's having invaders. And so that's why it's very difficult sometimes just have this natural prairie look without having a lot of invaders. And that's the same problem that happens to our lawns, our gardens, is because there's just so much surrounding vegetation that's unwanted that blows in. So looking a little bit more at these methods to prevent weeds, let's start with reduced soil cultivation. So as a rule of thumb, let's avoid working the soil unless we're planting in the soil or preparing it for planting. Like I said, the more you turn the soil, the more weed seeds. And then, you know, when it comes back to a lawn, a thick lawn is a weed-freer lawn too. So here again, hoeing, those type of things we're going to reduce. The tighter plant canopies, you know, here again, allow those plants to close the space, shade the soil. You know, what is a correct spacing? Well, you know, 1/2 the plant spread minus a few inches should bring those plants together. You know, I think it's back to your gardening style though too. You know, some people like each plant to be its own individual specimen. Other people like that cottage garden effect, you know, where everything just kind of masses together. The biggest disadvantage to probably this tighter spacing could potentially be increased diseases because you reduce that airflow between the plant materials to dry the foliage out. And of course, as we know, moisture on leaves is what increases our likelihood of diseases. So this next section is probably going to be a review, because I think one of the first sessions we had, oh my gosh, a month ago, we spent a whole hour and a half on mulching. A lot of people commented and said, oh my gosh, I didn't really think there was that much to cover about mulching. So we're going to get kind of here again a little bit of review, because this is, like I said, one of the best cultural practices to prevent weeds. So as we said, shades the soil. And of course, we know it also conserves moisture, cools the soil, cooler soils, better root growth. And then also, as these organic mulches break down, they provide organic matter and a little bit of nutrients to help feed the plant materials. And so overall, they're just a very good benefit to our average garden. So the recommendation is about a 2 to 3 inch layer. Most people don't mulch to that depth because of the cost and the expense, but it does require at least that 2-3 inches to get those benefits we're talking about. If you go more shallow, you're going to have more weed growth. You're going to have a lot more water evaporation through the mulch itself. The theory of mulch is it dries out, heats up, but that interface between the mulch and the soil is where it stays cooler and drier. And kind of that 2 to 3 inch layer, it's from the tip of your finger to the knuckles. For ladies, it may be the joint. And also then we keep that mulch just slightly away from the crown of the plant. So then the question always is, well, what do I use? Well, here again, organic wood-based mulch is what most of us do. To me, what you use is really all about the aesthetics of the mulch. It's what do you like, and then what can you afford. We all have our own little likes and dislikes. The plants could care less what's put around them. They don't really know. They can't see. So it's really us that care about the texture, the color, the source of the mulch itself. And of course, the choices are overwhelming. There's this little upper right, left-hand corner picture of all the different mulches on display. Most of the mulches tend to gray out, kind of that upper middle picture to that kind of grayish color. Some people don't like that. The wheelbarrow full of grass clippings. Ideally, we're not catching our grass clippings, but grass clippings are a great, one season mulch for vegetable gardens, those type of things. We're going to talk about a pesticide, a herbicide later on that you never ever want to catch the grass clippings from, because it doesn't dissipate from the clippings and can harm your plant materials. Lower left there, the poor little gazania surrounded by the red mulch. I think most of you know my mantra is mulch is to provide a function. It's not to provide color in the garden. I personally don't care for the dyed mulches. Even the black ones there to the right, I still think look a little unnatural. I'd rather have more just a natural earth tone or kind of graying out or brownish color. And then there in the middle is leaf mold, leaf compost. You save your leaves from the fall, and then you use them the next spring as a mulch. Works great in vegetable gardens, flower gardens. For those who've been to Missouri Botanical Garden, last time I was there, all their annual flower beds were mulched with leaves, which then break down and add more nutrients to the soil. As far as kind of mulch preferences, gardeners tend to prefer finer textured mulch, darker color mulch to set off the plants. Vegetable gardeners, you need to look at what I would say one season mulches, things that break down, that are compostable. Here again, the leaves, the grass clippings, the newspaper. Wood chip mulches in a vegetable garden, we gotta be very careful. If those get turned into the soil, then they're gonna rob the nitrogen fertilizer and slow the growth of our annual season vegetables. And then, when all possible, I would say buy locally made mulches. That just helps reduce the environmental footprint. Many of the local garden centers have drop-off sites for leaf, grass clip, or limbs, those type of things, where they shred, screen, dye, and sell back to us. So any questions up to this point, Karen? Okay, I'm going to take that as no, or Karen's getting a cup of coffee. So.
That was a no. I just couldn't unmute.
You guys got to know that Karen and I have a wonderful relationship, and we like to tease each other from time to time. So please take that as love and admiration for Karen when I said she's off getting a cup of coffee. Okay, so what happens when all these wonderful management practices fail? And sure enough, they do, because weeds are opportunistic. We're going to have a weed problem. So then we're left to just figuring out, how are we going to get a handle on our weed issue? So like anything, there's a logical process to how to control our weeds. So first of all, hopefully by now you've learned the first step is to identify the weed. You know, sometimes it's not as important to get down to the real specific, variety, genus, and sometimes you get close. Helps because that's going to tell us a little bit about the morphology of the plant. Of course, you all know that extension is your best source for identifying, and I will tell you, after answering more hotline calls here in the last few months, our master gardeners are one of the best users of our gardening hotline, especially when it sends in weed pictures, those type of things, testing us here at the office and your fellow master gardeners on weed identification. Books work great too. The problem with most books is you got to know a little bit about kind of their classification or type, because once you kind of figure out some diagnostic keys, you can start honing in. For like any weed in the mint family has a square stem. So you can figure out it has a square stem, you can immediately go to mint. If it's got a milky sap in it, that tells us, what type of weed it might go to, what group of weeds. And of course, there's diagnostic keys you can use too. I don't know, you always get the question, well, give me an app that I can put on my phone that's going to identify weeds. I don't know of a really good weed app. A lot of times when weeds come in, it's just kind of thumbing through the books and looking to kind of match it up and figuring out what it is. And then, of course, as I said before, the classification, whether it's annual, perennial, broadleaf, grass, sedge, is going to then start us down that road to what product or what method of control is going to be best. And let me state, I use the word product first, and hopefully you're going to see through this presentation that it's not always a chemical is your method of control. We've already talked about prevention, that's organic as your best control. And then once we determined what type of weed it is, we have to determine when's the best time to treat. Good example is, most people wait and treat dandelions when they're in full flower. That's the hardest time to control it. If we control that dandelion in the fall when it's just germinated, it's much easier to control, and it's also potentially less damaging with drift onto our desirable plants. And then determine the most effective method of control. Sometimes with these perennial weeds like poison ivy, wild violets, clover, sometimes if you really want to eradicate them, it's persistence. It's not a one and done strategy. Okay, a question on that? If not, we're going to dive into these.
Oh, wait, hold on just a sec, Dennis. Peggy has a question. I'm not sure if she's referring to this slide or the last one. It says, what is the weed in the upper, on the last slide. Can we go back one? No, I guess not. Yeah, she wants to know, what is the weed in the upper left on this slide?
Upper left, great question. Upper left is henbit. So that's the purple flowering winter annual, germinates in the fall, best controlled in the fall. The lower one, of course, is our good old friend dandelions, which of course there's a lot of people that love dandelions to be left alone because it's one of the best sources of pollen and nectar for pollinators, honeybees early in the spring. And then the upper right corner is a lovely, thick, established stand of crabgrass. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else, ma'am?
No.
Cool. Okay. So when it gets to our weed control options, we really basically boils down to three groups or three potential methods that people like to use. Mechanical, that's a great word for hand weeding. Organic, which of course are products that are derived from naturally organic materials. And then there's chemical methods also, which of course are man-made products. Keep in mind, organic products are also chemicals. It's just that they're derived from a natural source, not, from a man-made test tube lab of products going out there. And all of those, organic or chemical, if they're designed to kill a weed, they are a herbicide. It doesn't matter whether they're organic or a chemical, they're still both a herbicide. They still both are designed or labeled to kill a plant. So let's look at mechanical weed control. So we've already talked a lot about proper cultivation. We reduce our cultivation only when necessary for planting. The main way to do that is the good old-fashioned hoe. There are multiple different types of hoes on the market. The kind of the classic hoe here in the picture. There's the stirrup hoe, that's the little round closed loop. Kind of hoes are kind of like mouse traps. Someone's always trying to build a better mousetrap. Someone's always trying to come up with a better hoe. One of the problems I think a lot of people have with their garden equipment, and I'll say this especially with hoes and then shovels, is that they do not have a sharp blade. If a hoe is dull, it's going to be much more difficult to skim through the soil, what we're going to talk about. And it's going to be much more difficult to chop through a weed. So if you have not sharpened the point of the blade of your hoe or your shovel in a while, that may be a good thing to take into the local hardware store, or you may just, do it yourself and file that and put a nice sharp edge. Because the ideal way to hoe is to what we call skim. Because what we're really trying to do is what we call dust mulching. So instead of, like in the picture here, you see like they're chopping and really turning that soil. So you come back 2 weeks later in that picture, there's probably gonna be crabgrass, all sorts of weeds already germinated back out, because here again, we fluffed up that soil, we've turned it to expose it to sunlight, and all the weed seeds are gonna germinate. So basically what skim hoeing or skimming the soil means, or dust mulching, is we're just gonna maybe go through and just cut through maybe 1/8 of an inch deep, 1/4 inch of the deep. We're just gonna slide that soil or that hoe through the soil, kind of just severing that upper just 1/4 inch of soil or so from the soil below it. And then that soil that's loose dries and becomes a dust mulch, because there's no way until it rains for that loose soil that's on top, I don't know if my little hand diagrams are helping or not, for it to then conduct water and moisture through to that lower soil. And so it kind of acts like that little mulch layer, dust layer, to stop germination. And so that's the best way if you're going to go in and cultivate. You're between your aisles, your rows, your vegetable garden, those type of things. The best way, I don't know if it's going to look here, but kind of like I got the sheet of paper here pulled up, and here's my subsoil, the notepad itself. So all I'm doing is going through with that mulch and that hoe and just basically severing that thin layer there. It's going to fall back to the surface, but yet it's not going to connect vascular system, but water movement wise, and you create this dust mulching. And of course, the smaller the plant, the better it is. The more it's established, the more root system is, it's going to be harder to cut through and make that skimming action. And of course, it's best when there's moisture in the soil. So when I say best after a rainfall, I really mean not wet soil, but it's easier to move through a little bit moist soil than a dry soil, because the dry soil with our heavy clay gets very hard, very compacted very quickly. Okay, are there any questions on, before I move to organic, before I move to organic weed control, any questions on mechanical hand weeding? Of course, I didn't mention, you get on your hands and knees, you can pull weeds with your fingers, those type of things. in today's or yesterday's, those on the Deanna Rose list, Brian had a wonderful quote about the therapeutic nature of hand weeding. I thought was very appropriate. Almost cut and pasted into this presentation. I forgot to do that. Karen, any questions?
No, I think we're going to hold off for now.
Okie dokie. Okay. So let's look at organic weed control. So these are going to be products that are not synthetic, made in a lab. They're natural, more natural occurring products. I will tell you, they are limited number of products on the market. Feedback is success is often less than anticipated. And like I said earlier, any product that kills is a pesticide. So organic products are pesticides, organic weed controls are herbicides. And just because it's organic does not mean it's safer, it just means it's natural. What I see a lot of times, people say, oh, I use an organic product, so they don't take precautions of gloves, proper equipment, those type of things, or proper handling. Just keep in mind, yes, they are natural, but that does not necessarily mean they're safer. And I'll point that out here in just a second. So here again, the best organic weed control is mulching prevention. I can't state that enough. That is our best weed control. So one option for weed control is flame or torch. So this is burning the weed. And there's all sorts of little propane. You get the little camping propane canisters you can get. You put a tip wand on it, and then you burn the leaves. So here's the pros and cons of torching weeds. Only works on annual weeds because it has no effect on killing a root system. So if you have Bermuda grass in your vegetable garden or a dandelion, and you burn off the top, that plant has enough energy in its root system and its crown that it's going to grow right back. Also, on a really well-established annual plant, it may also come back on you. So the ideal with torching is it needs to be a younger plant, and it needs to completely burnt to the ground, so to speak. If not, it can come back from the root system. Its use is probably best, as this picture shows here, in gravel walks, drives, around bricks, those type of things. It can be used out in the garden, but here's a very big but. Keep in mind, mulches, straw, grass, leaves, wood are all highly flammable. So it goes without saying, you have to be extremely cautious with torches. Like I said, only really tender, young annuals are really where it works best. I know some of our demonstration gardens, the Deanna Rose has used torch from time to time in all the bricks out there to control weeds somewhat effectively. So it is an option, but it's got very, very limited uses. Another organic weed control option is solarization. So basically what you're doing is covering the area of your soil garden with plastic, clear or black. You need the temperature of the heat up to at least 140 plus degrees. I've got here a 4 to 6 week process. Well, that 4 to 6 is probably during July and August. That 4 to 6 weeks is not going to be during January, February, March, or April. It's got to get that internal temperature of that soil probably 6 to 8 inches deep, heated up to that 140 plus degrees to sterilize it. So really what you're in some way doing is taking that block of soil out of production for the entire season. And also keep in mind, it'll kill the earthworms, the beneficial bacteria, fungi, those type of things in the soil. It could also kill some of the bad things too. Some of the soil-borne organisms, pests, diseases, those type of things. But also keep in mind, if you sterilize that soil, that does not prevent dandelions seeds from blowing in, other seeds from blowing in. So it is an option. It may work best if you've got a vegetable garden where you've got like a perennial, Bermuda grass, zoysia, and you don't want to use chemicals coming in your garden. It may help on bindweed. You probably want to do a whole season for bindweed. So it may be an option out there. So it is an option. It has, like torching, it has some pluses, it has some minuses, but it is an option. The last other organic weed control in the market that's really been popularized the last few years is this horticulture vinegar. Now this is not the vinegar you got on your cabinet that you put in your pickles and recipes at home, because that's only like 5% acidity. This is 20%. And at 20% acidity, this will burn your skin. So it's something you've got to be cautious with, even though it's organic product. It pretty much has the same limited uses as the torch does. It really only going to burn off the top growth. It's not going to be transported into the root system, into the crown of the plant. So it's only going to really burn the tops. So it's got to be fairly tender, young weeds really to have any effect on horticulture vinegar. I don't see it on the market that much in many garden centers. I know on the internet you can buy it all the time, but I just don't see, when I walk into a grass pad suburban, I don't see horticulture vinegar on the shelf. I know a lot of organic gardeners swear by it, but it does have its limitations. Other organic weed products, a few years ago, corn gluten was a hot product. I don't see corn gluten around as much anymore. Preen even had a version of it on the market because corn gluten is a very valuable commodity in this day and age, and using it for weed control is a low priority. Research, Iowa State's the one that found this out. They had a pile of corn gluten sitting out behind one of their buildings, and they realized that no grass weeds grew there after it was stockpiled there for a while. So they did some more research on it and found that it has some weak effect on controlling grassy annual weeds like crabgrass, those type of things. Probably the best benefit from corn gluten is it's 9% nitrogen. That's probably one of the highest organic nitrogen only fertilizer sources out there on the market. So there you also see it sold as luscious lawn. Originally it was touted to be a lawn crabgrass control product. I don't think there's a label anymore that I've seen on the market that really uses it much more than spot weeding, those type of things. So that's corn gluten is another organic option. So I'm going to stop there because that's.
Dennis.
I know. Yeah. Yes.
Hi. Julie wants to know if this is the same as the chemical reagent acetic acid.
What's that? The vinegar?
Julie, do you want to hop on?
I'll see if I can pull maybe the question down and see what she's referring to.
Okay.
I have no idea what
acid. It's acetic acid. It's used in labs and it'd be available through chemical supply companies.
I've never heard of acetic acid being used as a weed control product, unless it's got some other name on it, Julie.
Well, acetic acid is vinegar.
Oh, okay. Duh. I've never heard it labeled as that. It's okay. Yeah, you're right. It is vinegar. I'm sorry. No, I just always heard it sold as a horticulture vinegar.
Yeah, I just thought it might be cheaper to get through chemical supply than fancied up called horticultural.
Okay, well, if it's the same thing, then sure, you can give it a try. Here again, on any of those products that work by burning, it's got to be very careful where you target it, because if it touches your desirable plants, you're gonna have a problem also. So it'll burn your foliage of your hosta, your green bean plant too. Okay. So the question about poison ivy, we'll address that later. Okay.
I think the other questions are coming up, Dennis, in the PowerPoint.
Okay, cool. Anything else before we move on to chemicals?
No, I think that our questions are going to be addressed in the next section.
Okay. So just kind of moving through here, we're going to move next for the rest of the session and talk a little bit more about chemical weed control. it's going to be a bigger portion of this because there are more options out there. But what I've tried to do is hopefully express that chemicals are always a last resort. They're not always, I've got a problem, so I spray something on it. It's really going through, no matter what, it's an insect, disease, a weed, figuring out what the problem is. And as I said, what's the best solution and the least impact on the environment. And so that's kind of the same process I'm taking here with this Kill Your Weeds program. So on chemical weed control, read and follow all labeled instructions, because there's a lot of times hidden gems of information on that label. I'm going to point out here a little bit later on one of the products. Here again, you got to identify the weed. If the weed is not on the label or the crop you're applying it to, it is illegal technically to apply that product. No one's going to come out and police you. There's no chemical police out there in your backyard. But what's the purpose if we know, let's say trying to control crabgrass is not on that label, 2,4-D, it's a useless application. It's a waste of a product and time. So always select the correct product. Just because also the weed's on the label doesn't necessarily mean it's the best control ever for that weed. It just means that through testing, it has some effect on it. And then of course, apply it at the correct stage. So, here again, usually the younger, the more tender, less established the weed, easier to control. And keep in mind, herbicides are designed to kill weeds. So an insecticide will have no effect on the health of a weed.
Dennis?
Yes.
We have a question from Bob that I missed over. Won't it take a while for plants to grow well in soil that has been solarized? Doesn't it become dirt rather than soil?
Not really, no. Soils that have been sterilized, solar sterilized, quickly regain a lot of their micronutrients, or not micronutrients, microorganisms, things like that come back. So, we grow in sterilized soil all the time. If you're growing transplants, starting seedlings, for the most part, sterilized soil. So you'll need to add fertilizer, those type of things. But no, plants will respond and grow back in them. Years ago, all our strawberries, before they put a new strawberry crop in, they sterilize the soil because of soil-borne pathogens and grew another strawberry crop. A lot of times that's not happening anymore because the effects on the environment of using those strong chemicals.
Thank you.
So there is also chemical ways to sterilize the soil, but no homeowner should ever be doing that. Okay. So let's just kind of look at kind of a series of various herbicides on the market. By no means is this going to cover every herbicide on the market. The other thing that's very trendy now with herbicides on the homeowner market is to create what I call a cocktail mixture. So a lot of times there's just not one herbicide in there, but there's maybe 2, 3, 4 different herbicides. Because here again, the more you mix in that, the wider your control. Because some may target dandelions better, where another one may do henbit better, where another one may do black medic better, or another one may do oxalis better. So by putting this cocktail mix in there, you get better control. And what everybody wants, weeds dead immediately. They want a quick burn down. They don't want to wait for it. We're impatient and we want one application to control everything. If not, we think it's a failure. And like I said, sometimes it's just persistence that's going to pay off. So let's just kick it off here with probably the most controversial herbicide on the market. It's the glyphosate, which people know as Roundup. But keep in mind, glyphosate is now off patent. And so about every chemical company that bottles a herbicide uses probably glyphosate as in some form in their mixture. So it's just not sold as Roundup anymore. Roundup is what we call a non-selective herbicide. As you can see in the picture of this tomato plant, Roundup works by blocking photosynthesis and chlorophyll production in the plant. So without chlorophyll, the plant can't make any energy and it dies. So that's why you spray a weed with Roundup, it turns yellow, white, and then dies because it cannot make energy through its mode of action. And it is a contact herbicide. You have to directly spray it onto the plant to get control, and it's post-emergent. So it does not stop any weeds from germinating. We have pre-emergent herbicides, which doesn't really stop them from germinating, but it stops them from establishing once they germinate. And then you have post-emergent, which means it controls the weed after it's up and growing. And Roundup, being a contact herbicide, has a short residual. So you spray the weed today and a seedling pops up tomorrow, that seedling tomorrow is not going to be affected by the phosphate application. Roundup's probably best on annual broadleaf and grassy weeds. Roundup is probably not the best option for a perennial plant because of that extensive root system. Sometimes it takes multiple applications with glyphosate. So the issue with glyphosate, and this really has turned into more of a political, social issue on Roundup more than really a scientific issue. If you Google Roundup, you will find quickly millions of hits. And a lot of times what you'll find is that Roundup is the scourge of the earth. Glyphosate is a carcinogen. It's harmful to touch, to use. You know, there's commercials on TV about joining these class action lawsuits if you use glyphosate and develop some sort of cancer. And everyone kind of has their personal opinion on what factual information they believe. You know, is it fake news? Is it real news? And so I'm not going to hear this change anyone's mind on the use of Roundup or glyphosate. But from what I've been trained, what I've learned is that most of that information that is anti-Roundup is only analyzing portions of the research and drawing conclusions. Now, the other side says just the opposite thing. You know, those that think Roundup is safe are only really drawing from the conclusions they want. But unfortunately, Roundup was originally manufactured by the Monsanto Corporation, which now Monsanto does not exist. Bayer bought out Monsanto several years ago. And unfortunately, Monsanto had a lot of backlash because they, at the time, were the leading company in genetically modified plants. So the genetically modified corn, soybeans, those type of things. And of course, I'm getting kind of, you know, here on uncharted territory that's going to upset some of you, maybe not. And so there's a lot of backlash to the Monsanto Corporation over genetically modified organisms. And Roundup, because it's also a Monsanto product, kind of got out there. You know, there's this group of people that their whole mission in life was to destroy the Monsanto Corporation. You know, on a personal statement, I really don't understand why Bayer bought them, because in Europe, they shied away from genetically modified organisms, but now they control, the Bayer Corporation controls the vast majority of chemicals on the market and controls pretty much the vast majority of the research into genetically modified organisms, which gives them a lot of power, a lot of control over our farm crops, not only here in America, but worldwide. So Roundup, use it if you think it's safe. If you don't use it. You know, it's a personal decision on that product. Did I stimulate any questions on Roundup before I move off of it?
No, I don't see any questions on Roundup. Only one person wanted to know about what, in this situation, would you use 4,2-D?
Well, we'll talk. We'll get into that a little bit later. So,
perfect.
Yeah, no, Roundup and 2,4-D would have two completely different uses. Roundup is really this non-selective herbicide. You can't spray it on any desirable plants because it will kill it also. So Roundup has to be a very targeted application to the weed only. it's very safe. You have, two weeds growing side by side. You can brush it on, just target it on this, and this weed will not be harmed. It has no volatilization. It doesn't really move in the air. It doesn't move in the soil. It has to be contact with the product. 2,4-D, other products have vapors that drift, and you spray 2,4-D on a broadleaf plant here, this broadleaf plant right next to it is probably going to show some herbicide injury. So that's why Roundup became the most commonly used herbicide, is because of its mode of action being only contact, no drift, very short half-life, no soil action, breaks down.
Dennis, I'm going to ask you a question, but you don't have to answer it. In the right situation, would you personally use it?
I use Roundup all the time.
Okay.
In my garden. I wear gloves. I wash my hands. I thoroughly clean up. I'm very cautious when I spray it because I don't want to touch desirable plants. I usually go for a coarser spray versus a finer spray to reduce any drift or non-target applications. If I'm really concerned about the desirable plant, I'll take a piece of cardboard, a bucket with me, and I'll shield the plant with it. But I'm very careful, just going right up and just dripping right onto that individual plant.
Perfect.
But that's me. That's me. Just because I'm safe with it. If you are not, don't use it. No one's out there forcing you to use this product. It is a choice.
If you spray Roundup on a weed at the base of a tree, and like you use a piece of cardboard so it doesn't drift onto the tree trunk, but yet it's still at the base of the tree, it will harm the tree, right?
No, absolutely not.
Okay, good.
Roundup has no mode of action through the soil.
Perfect.
Once it hits the soil, it goes inert. It breaks down. It is not picked up. Now, we're going to talk about other chemicals that will harm that tree, but Roundup will not. In fact, if it's even a thick bark tree, you could probably spray Roundup on the bark of the tree and not even harm it. Now, I wouldn't recommend that. That bark is dead tissue. It's got to have tissue that conducts fluids. It's got to be live tissue. So no, if you got a weed at the base of a tree, you can spot spray it. Like I said, I showed this, side by side. As long as they're not joined part of the plant, it would not have any effect. That's why people like it, because it's so targeted. You have to put the product on the plant to affect it.
Cool. We're ready to move on.
Okay. So other weed control products out there, the trifluralin, this is Trufflan in the ag community, and then dithopyr, which is the most commonly probably applied crabgrass control in the spring. You see these now labeled for, well, both of these started out as crabgrass control products, and now they work their way into ornamental beds, not some flower, some vegetable, you got to read the label. A lot of these work best on grassy weeds and then so-so on broadleaf weeds, but these are pre-emergent. So these are applied before the weeds germinate or a clean cultivated soil. So a lot of people are familiar with the product Preen. That's the one that's got the trifluralin in it. Unfortunately, the disadvantage of that product, it probably lasts maybe 4 to 6 weeks. All these herbicides that are soil mode have a residual. In other words, how long they're going to last in the soil before they start breaking down. Dithopyr, which like I said is a very common crabgrass control, is now you're starting to find that into some ornamental uses. Several products. I was trying to find the label this morning and I ran out of time, but you might check. So Preen's not the only now home garden weeder on the market. The dithopyr is also out there, and between those two products, dithopyr is going to have a much longer residual. My personal take, back to, the question, do I use Roundup? I said the answer is yes. My take, do I use Preen type products in my flower garden and vegetable garden? No. Why? I use prevention. I mulch. I do little cultivation. and I hand weed. But these are a tool for people to use. But I think there's other options out there that are probably just as good for them. Here again, no judgments whether you use them or not. I'm just kind of putting out there the information of options on the market for you. And preen's been around forever. You got to read the label really close on these because there may be some crops that are not on there. And since these are pre-emergence, you cannot go in and seed your radishes, carrots, cucumbers, whatever, and apply this because it's going to stop potentially the germination of those seeds too. So usually these are only applied to well-established plants. So you got to, here again, read the label. And so we get into this whole group of broadleaf weeds, the 2,4-Ds, dicamba, carfentrazone, MCC, MCPP. There's a number of these on the market. And all these are designed for broadleaf weed control only. They will not control grassy weeds. These are all what we call post-emergent contact herbicides. So in other words, you've got to apply them directly to the actively growing plant. You can find a lot of these in liquid and granular form. My take is if weed control is your option, is your goal, liquid is superior to granular. And the reason being is for a granular product to stick to that weed, you've got to have a wet surface for that little piece of impregnated granular to stick to the leaf. Where if I'm spraying a mist over that, I'm going to get a lot thorough coverage. And since these work on contact, the more thorough the coverage, the more effective the control. So if you're out controlling broadleaf weeds, I would recommend liquid over granular. The problem though with a lot of these products, especially the 2,4-D, is this herbicide drift issue. They tend to volatilize in the atmosphere on vapors, and then those vapors are taken in through the stomata of the leaf, which is how the leaf, breathes, so to speak. And that's where you get the curling, the puckering, herbicide drift injury, which is our #1 hotline problem late May, early June. Dicamba is very controversial now in the agricultural world. If you follow that, dicamba, several years ago, they released a dicamba resistant soybean variety that you could then, instead of spraying Roundup resistant corn soybean varieties, you're gonna have this dicamba resistant soybean, but dicamba drifts. And so what they found is these dicamba sprays on the soybean fields were killing the neighbor's soybeans that were not dicamba resistant. And there are all sorts of lawsuits. Dicamba is banned in agricultural uses in many states now. Kansas has regulations around the use of dicamba in soybeans. So does Missouri. So you gotta be careful. The other thing about dicamba is it has soil action. As we've talked about, a lot of these herbicides, once they hit the soil, they kind of inert, they don't move into the soil. Dicamba will move into the soil. And actually dicamba will damage the root system of trees, especially a lot of our evergreen trees. So if you have like spruces, pines, I would not apply any broadleaf herbicides within the drip line of those trees. In fact, I'd probably stay out several feet away from that. And like I said, these all kind of have similar mode of actions. A lot of these work, I talked about Roundup works by stopping chlorophyll production. In a nutshell, what some of these broadleaf herbicides do, and the reason you see all this twisted curling foliage is because what they do is they speed up cell division. In layman's terms, what they do is cause the plant to grow itself to death. In other words, it causes the cell divide and support itself and it collapses. So that's why you see all the twisted curling foliage grow. Karen, any questions?
Yes. How do you know how long a container, example preen or any of these other substances, will last before it loses its effectiveness?
That's a great question. That was not a topic I had a slide in here, but I'll answer that real quickly. If it's a liquid product, well, all products should be stored cool and dry. It's going to extend their shelf life. If it's a liquid product, if you shake it and it's still in solution, chances are it's still good. If you shake it and it's chunky, precipitated, I think is the word, the chemical word, then it's no good. If it's a granular product, as long as it's still flowable, it could go through a spreader, and the bag's been somewhat sealed tight, I would consider it still good. If it's moist, it's a block, then probably not. And then of course you can dispose of the chemicals that are hazardous household waste drop-off sites here in Johnson County.
Okay, great
3
answer.
to 5 years or more. Sometimes the can's so rusty, you can't get it open without, causing damage. Chlordane, people are still finding chlordane that's been banned probably for 30, 40 years in people's garages, and it's still good.
Great answer, thanks.
Okay. Anything else?
No.
Cool. So another product out there, we're still in the broadleaf herbicides, is this triclopyr. And it's a broadleaf herbicide, but it's probably better on perennial weeds. So a lot of times this is the go-to for poison ivy, brush killer, even like clover, wild violets, those type of things. Triclopyr can drift, probably not as bad as the 2,4-D products. And so you'll see this in a lot of different products. It's, here in the clay, you see the Weed Be Gone, but it's not the typical Weed Be Gone, just a 2,4-D mix, but the Weed Be Gone chickweed, clover, and oxalis killer is triclopyr. And so you've got to really read the fine print labels to find out what the active ingredient are. Just don't go by the name, because if you're looking for triclopyr and you just pick up Weed Be Gone, you don't have the triclopyr formulation. And like I said, it's sold in a lot of brush killers, poison ivy killers, those type of things. It's become kind of the go-to product probably for the homeowner for perennial weeds. Here again, only applied to grassy lawns, those type of things. You can't apply it to desirable broadleaf plants because it'll kill this, because it's non-selective broadleaf herbicide. So one that's relatively new on the homeowner market is this quincorlac. It's a post-emergent herbicide, but it will control a wide range of grassy and broadleaf weeds, which makes it unique. So pretty much all the chemicals we've looked at now, except Roundup, either control grassy weeds or they control broadleaf weeds. But very few of them control both grassy and broadleaf weeds that have emerged. And so you're starting to see this product come into the homeowner market. And you see it a lot of times in here again, those formulations. It's just not pure quincorlac, but there's 2 or 3 other chemicals in there. And it's excellent on those perennial weeds like the bindweed, clover, violets, those type of things. But if you read the fine print, it says loud and clear, do not use clippings in mulch or compost. This is one of 2 products. The other one's not available on the homeowner market for Pyralid, that does not dissipate enough that it would not potentially harm a plant if you save grass clippings and mulch your vegetables directly or mulch your compost. So if you have a commercial lawn service coming and you use your grass clippings as mulch or compost, you really want to search out what chemicals they're using. If you're the person that goes up and down the street and picks up the neighbor's grass clippings, you probably want to know what product they're applying to make sure you're not getting one of these products that do not dissipate. Most of the other broadleaf herbicides, let me just use the word, most of the other broadleaf herbicides, the recommendation is after an application, do not catch clippings for at least 3 mowings before you use them as a mulch or in compost. On most of them, they move through the plant system, they dissipate, they break down, but this quincorlac and chlorpyrrolid, which is only commercial, does not break down even after 3 mowings. So you just got to be very cautious. This is why we say read the label. This do not use clippings was clearly on this weed stop label. But I had to scroll down about 6-8 pages of precautionary and use recommendations before the one sentence popped out that said, do not use or for mulch or compost. So if you don't read that label, you just go directly to 2 ounces per gallon of water, you could cause some problems.
Dennis,
Yes.
would now be a good time to discuss Tordon RD?
Okay, yeah. I do not have Tordon RTU in this presentation. Tordon is sold as a brush killer. It's not widely used, but it works really good on poison ivy and tree sprouts. And the way Tordon works is and it also is used to remove the invasive honeysuckle from our woodlands. And Tordon's unique. What you do is you cut off the plant and then you just treat the stump. And the ready-to-use formulation comes like a little squirt bottle, or I've seen it like in a little ketchup bottle that you just squeeze a drop or 2 out onto the cut surface. It's a very vivid, bright blue material. And all you want to do is apply enough that it just sticks to that cut surface. You don't want it to go into the soil because Tordon has soil action. You also would not want to apply it with a rainstorm coming because it could wash off and harm other plants. It's one of the best effective products. Growing up on the farm, we would use it to kill hedge trees that grew up in the pasture. We'd take a chainsaw, cut them off, coat all that surface with Tordon, and that hedge tree would not come back. And it's not widely available, but it is out there, and it has its uses as long as it's used properly.
So, if treating poison ivy, for example, is there merit to clipping off the stem, like you just mentioned, and then brushing on or spraying on what is left of the vine using that?
So Tordon is not, as far as I know, the ready-to-use form is not to use as a spray. It is not to hose down the whole poison ivy clump. It is only to be applied to the cut surface. It's already ready to use. It's already diluted out. It's not a spray. If you're going to spray the poison ivy plant, then you're back probably to the triclopyr as your product of choice as a homeowner.
Okay, and one more question. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you hold, because I have one more thought. So there are also another class of herbicides out there, which I did not put in this section because most urbanites should not be using them. And these are what are called soil sterilants, like pyramitol. These are sometimes sold under the term season-long control. And these products are applied a lot of times, like if you got a gravel driveway where you get weeds coming up in the gravel, those type of things. Or a lot of times they're put around under fence lines, things like that, where you don't want to weed eat. But a lot of those season-long controls are so effective because their mode of action is not absorption all into the plant, but also they temporarily sterilize the soil. And you got to be very cautious of those products too, because they leach and move. And so if you've got a gravel driveway and it's lined with a row of trees 2-3 feet back off the drive, those roots in that gravel driveway are going to pick up that soil sterilant, and it's going to harm or damage the tree. So you got to be very cautious with those products. That's one of the reasons I probably didn't put it in here, because for most this audience we're dealing with, I don't think you should be using those products. I think you're going to have more potential problems, especially with a lot of desirable trees, shrubs on your property. Hey, you had a question, Karen.
Most of the questions seem to be which chemical is most effective for killing certain plants. Do you want those questions now?
I got a couple more slides, and then let's get into specific weed control next, okay?
Perfect.
Is that a deal? Okay. A chemical that actually I've learned from master gardeners is this one called tenacity. Nimblewill, which we talked about last time, has become a very aggressive perennial grass in a lot of areas. And this Tenacity is a newer product on the market that has a wide range of grassy and broadleaf controls. It's labeled for cool season lawns, but it will take care of a lot of really difficult perennial weeds like the nimble grass, windmill grass, oxalis, wild violets. It's expensive. It's got some precautions on the label, but it's getting to be more widespread. I was in a garden center yesterday, and it was there on the shelf on the market. Not everyone carries it because of its expense, but that's one. If you got one of these more difficult weeds, you may want to look at using it as a control. Then we have these what we call over the top type products that will control annual and perennial grassy weeds out of ornamental flowers and vegetables. You got to read the label about the vegetables, but these are post-emergent. There are things like called over the top, grass killer, post. And here again, you'll see this a lot of times in perennial gardens. We've got perennial grassy weeds. Like the classic picture is where you've got a juniper full of Bermuda grass growing up through it. These type of products can be, following label instructions, can be applied over the top to a desirable plant and just selectively control out these grassy weeds. And these are on the market too. They have their place. Here again, a lot of times hand weeding, hand removal in flower vegetable gardens is probably the best way to go as opposed to chemical options. And then of course we have sedges. Remember at the start of the presentation, sedges are not grasses, sedges are not broadleaf weeds, sedges are their own group of plants. And so you need herbicides that are targeted for them. There's two on the market, the halosulfuron and the sulfentrazone. Both of them are pre-emergent. You've got to read the label really close because some are labeled for ornamental beds, some are labeled for vegetable gardens, some are only labeled for lawn use. So you got to read the label really close. And even these products, I'm going to say it's going to take multiple applications to bring them under control. But if sedge is your problem, so here again, knowing your weed, knowing the right product is going to give you better results. So kind of wrapping up here, weed control effectiveness, like I said, it's hard to select and control a perennial out of a perennial, whether grass or broadleaf. It's easier to control a grass out of a broadleaf or vice versa. As I said, it's easier to control before they become established, that seedling stage. Back to my problem, my fight with redbud seedlings is when they just germinate, I can go through and just easily pull them out. But once they get that little taproot system on them, it's a booger to get them out of the ground. And it's easier to control when the plant's immature as opposed to well-established or flowering. So kind of wrapping up here, this kind of leads in. So what bothers you? What weeds do you have a problem with in your various gardens? And that probably is just going to be what we're going to end up with questions on. But here again, the prevention is worth a pound of cure. So your best management practice is probably mulching. Now, as we talked about last time, a lot of our beneficial pollinators, solitary bees, are ground dwelling nesting. So we may want to be cautious about mulching everything, leaving them some space, or maybe using leaf litter versus wood chip. It's more natural. But mulch is still, by and large, our best prevention, and also staying on top of them. Once they get out of control, they're much more difficult to handle. So choose your best weeding option, whether that's hand, organic, or chemical, or a combination of those. Choose your best option. And with that, I will stop and open it up for questions. So Karen, why don't you run through the list you have first, then we'll open it up for people to unmute and ask questions.
Perfect. So I do want to point out that the chat box is being used by a lot of our EMGs to answer other EMGs questions or to put in additional knowledge. So I would encourage everyone to check that. There's some really great information in there on the Tordon as well as methods that other EMGs use in particular instances. In regards to questions for Dennis, the most questions we have right now are which chemical is the most effective for ground ivy? You want me just to give you the list or just one at a time?
One at a time.
Ground ivy.
Ground ivy, I would do the triclopyr.
Okay. Wild grapevine weeds. Wild grapevine weeds.
That's an interesting one. You usually don't see that. A lot of people call that a desirable plant, and I don't really see that one being an issue in the urban landscape. But grapes are highly sensitive to 2,4-D. In fact, 2,4-D is one of the biggest problems in vineyards in the Midwest. So probably 2,4-D or Roundup would take it out.
Okay, pokeweed.
Pokeweed is a perennial. You know, honestly, if you just have one pokeweed in your backyard, I'd probably just dig it out. You know, if not, I'd probably use, depending where it's growing. Here again, a lot of these weeds, it's going to depend on where it's growing. Is this pokeweed growing in the middle of your flower garden, or is it growing in wasteland? If it's growing in the middle of your flower garden, then you probably want to hand dig it. The next option would be to spot spray it with Roundup. Even though it's a broadleaf weed, your last option in a flower garden or a vegetable garden would be a broadleaf herbicide, because many of those drift. So here again, you've got to not only analyze the weed itself, but where is it growing? You know, is that poison ivy growing right in the middle of my prized plant that I don't want to harm? Or is it growing in the chain link fence where if I kill everything around it, it doesn't matter? So you've got to really think through how those products affect other plants. So Nancy made the comment about in the chat box I saw about Tordon versus glyphosate in honeysuckle control, because you know, I think if I read it right, you know, Tordon's more effective, but glyphosate has less problems with the wonderful trees and shrubs that are native, that are desirable, growing around that honeysuckle. So here again, it's kind of about I call it kind of a trade-off.
Common milkweed.
Well, common milkweed, boy, if I tell people to kill that, I'm going to have a whole bunch of master gardeners very. You know, I think on the Facebook page earlier this week, someone talked about hand pulling common milkweed where you don't want it, and allowing it to grow potentially in areas where it could colonize to be beneficial to the pollinators, and then removing the seed head so it doesn't go to seed. But common milkweed's a broadleaf weed, so any of the broadleaf herbicides, and since it's a perennial plant, I'd probably here again go back to that triclopyr. But keep in mind, it's beneficial to the monarchs.
Watergrass.
That's nutsedge. Watergrass is the sedge. So we covered those two products.
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of these. Creeping Charlie.
That is the ground ivy.
Okay.
So I do see a question popped up here. Has everyone used a home treatment made of vinegar, Epsom salts, and Dawn? Okay. I'm going to get on my master gardener soapbox. As master gardeners, you will never ever make those recommendations. There is no researched, scientific-based information for Epsom salts, Dawn, any of those. Those are wives' tale remedies. And no, those are not going to control a weed. The horticulture 20% vinegar will. You know, potentially vinegar, Epsom salts, Dawn may burn the foliage of a plant, but it's not going to kill it. This is where you've got to take, you know, science and folklore and make a decision. You know, if you read, you know, Epsom salts cures everything in the world. Baking soda cures everything in the world. Dawn dish soap cures everything in the world. But none of those are labeled for plant use. And the label on those is the law. And nowhere does it say that you can use them on a plant. So no, don't waste your time, energy, money on any of these concoctions. I don't care how many times it goes around Facebook, social media that, oh my gosh, my Dawn Epsom salt mixture was the most wonderful herbicide. That person's delusional. How's that for a brash statement?
That's a good one. So this person wants to know, if we look up plants, does the information tend to include that it might be a garden thug?
So now we're back to what bugs you, to the garden thug. So what I tell people on the thug issue is keywords: aggressive grower, spreads and fills in quickly. Those are things I look at. I also kind of do research on how does it multiply? What is its growth habit? Is it a crown clump forming habit? Or is it a plant that tends to have runners or rhizomes by mode of spread? So that's how I deduce. But if I read anything that says fills in quickly, that raises a red flag for me.
Okay, I'm going to stop asking questions. Everybody can unmute if you'd like to ask any more questions.
And I'm sorry if I offended anyone about my Epsom salts. I guess I did it overly harsh to make a point, not to offend anyone.
Dennis, we have a real problem around where I live with the Bermuda grass totally invading the flower beds. What would be the best way of trying to deal with that stuff?
So I would look at several options. You could certainly do hand removal. You could create what I would call a border, a dead zone between the gardens and the Bermuda. And so just on a regular basis, come in there, chop all those runners out. Of course, you got to get it out of the garden first. Your second option with that, if you don't want to do hand, would be to still maybe have that foot dead zone, no bare soil area or mulched area, and then just come by periodically and spray glyphosate and kill back those runners. Your other option would be to look at some of those over-the-top products, the Fusilade, those type of things I showed earlier on a slide, and look at the label to see if the flower that the Bermuda grass is in is on the label, and then you could slowly eradicate that out of the garden with those over-the-top products. Or, here again, hand dig all those runners, rhizomes out, and then start over. Anyone else?
Dennis?
Yes.
I have two things in my flower garden. Invasive liriope, which I've been trying to get rid of for years, and I end up digging it, and it, of course, comes up other places. And then the henbit, and it's intermingled in among my flowers.
Okay. So let's take those one at a time. So the green spicata liriope that spreads everywhere. Here again, some people consider that a wonderful ground cover. Others consider it a garden thug. I would probably tackle it using glyphosate. It's going to take multiple applications, but I would look at using that product and just staying on top of it. Unfortunately, if it's spread through a garden, you may have to sacrifice some of your desirable perennials around it to get rid of it. But in the long run, I think that's well worth it. As far as henbit goes, you could try a pre-emergent, but you're going to have to apply it in September because that's a fall germinating weed. The problem is you don't find a lot of pre-emergents in the fall, but you might look at some of the newer products that contain that ditopyr and see henbits on the label and put that in the fall. Your other option, I think, is mulching would help control a lot of that, because here again, you're going to suffocate that out from germinating. Or then your other option is hand pulling that weed. You can't use a broadleaf herbicide in a perennial garden because your perennials are broadleaf plants. Spot spraying with Roundup, I think, would be very tedious because the way it's going to grow in amongst those other perennials, and then you're going to not be able to separate it out. If you're going to the work to pull it out of the perennial, it's got a really mild fly and root system on it. You might as well just go ahead and pull it out of the garden if you're going to start pulling it out of plants and put a chemical on it. I just pull it out.
Hello, Dennis.
Thank you.
Yes.
This is Ann Harvey. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, wonderful. I grew up with the lesson that if you don't get a weed's root, you don't get it. And yet the implication when I was listening was that that's very selective. Could you clarify that?
No, actually, Ann, I think your comment is correct. To really kill any plant, you've got to kill the roots and all. So I think you're correct. You know, especially perennial plants, you just cut the top off, they come right back up. Now, again, establishing, you know, a little piece of crabgrass or, you know, a little weed, you cut that off, it doesn't have enough energy in that root system to come back up. But no, that's why perennial weeds are so hard to control, because you really got to kill the root system out to get rid of it. So nope, you grew up the right strategy.
Thank you.
Dennis, do you have any suggestions for mint that's kind of growing wild in the yard?
Mint in a yard, I would use the broadleaf herbicides. Here again, that triclopyr, carfentrazone tend to be better on perennial weeds. So mint in the lawn, that one's going to be relatively simple. Mint in a flower garden where it's in amongst all your other plants is going to be much more difficult, because then you have to be much more selective with maybe the glyphosate, painting it directly on the mint itself. But mint in the lawn, treat it like any other broadleaf weed. You know, May had a question here. I'm sorry, May, about the tiger lilies. You could just dig up and replant and fill that out. You might also see if lilies are on those over-the-top products we talked about earlier with Julie's question, and see if lilies are on that, and you might be able to use that product. I grew up in southern Kansas and Bermuda grass country, and I never want to go back to that. I like my nice controlled fescue and bluegrass. Even though bluegrass does move into my garden quite a bit, and I have to pull its runners out, its rhizomes out. We should grow that aggressively in my lawn as it does into my nice flower garden soil. Okay, anything else? If not, Karen, I believe you can stop recording.
Okay.
And, we are still looking